In the beginning, there was darkness upon the void. See why I wanted dark? And then in 1962, Steve the Slug Russell said, "Let there be light." And he created a sun and stars and gravity. And he put two ships in orbit around that sun, locked in an endless struggle for survival. And he called it Space War, and it was good. The first good video game. I was born a couple years later, and the video game business and me, I guess we've been grown up together ever since. I'm the wiggly one there on the left. First part of my life, there really were no video games, but that was okay. We had other things. We had books, sci-fi and fantasy. We had some TV shows. There was even a reality show going on about that time when I was a kid. It was pretty fun to be part of. But it wasn't until 1971 that the first computer video game, the first arcade video game was created. It was created by two guys that shared an office at a technology company called Ampex. One of them had the idea. His name was Nolan Bushnell, and one of them actually knew how to build it. His name was Ted Dabney. And they created this game for a company called Nutting Associates, the first arcade video game. Oh, and by the way, that was a copy of Space War. 1972, the first home console comes out, the Magnavox Odyssey. I didn't have either of those, but my parents are both engineers. My dad worked at Boeing, and he would bring home these programmable calculators. And so some of the first programming I did on those machines. We also built a little 6800 hex keypad system. But one of the computers I learned to program on was a cardboard computer called the Cardiac. This is something that Bell Labs put out. And there's a lot about this online you can read about. It's a really interesting machine. It wasn't until 1977 that the first personal computers came out. Commodore PET, TRS-80, Apple II. Again, I didn't have those, but my mom had her master's in computer science by then, and she was working at a company called Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC for short. And she would bring home one of these. Probably a lot of you haven't seen this. This is a printing terminal. And you'd connect to a mainframe over the phone line, and then you didn't have a screen, you just had a printout. And so that was really good for playing adventure games like Zork. Also, arcade games were moving along at that time. This game, a lot of people don't know where this game was made by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak when they were working at Atari. 1977, you get this game, Space Wars. Again, we see Space War coming back. A guy recreated it from scratch, and it was the #1 selling arcade game in 1977. So you're going to learn a little of the history of the game business here. More arcade games came along. In 1981, I'm in high school, and I grew up in a town called Bellevue, Washington, which was right next to Redmond, Washington. Redmond was, of course, where Nintendo had their North American distribution center. So we were right down the street from Nintendo's office in the US. And so we had arcade machines, courtesy of Nintendo, in our high school. And a lot of my lunch money went into these machines. We also had some Apple IIs, and that was some more early programming for me. Does anybody here know this game? Yeah, go ahead, just shout it out. Wizardry, thank you very much. Very good. All right, I'm going to have a few more quizzes for you because I can tell this audience is sharp. I did not have an Apple II at home. I had one of these, an Atari 800, and I did a lot of my early programming on this machine. There were some fantastic games for this. Anyone know this game? Star Raiders. This one is one of my personal favorites, Mule, probably one of the best games of all time. If you've never heard about it, it's good to understand it. Maybe someday someone will do a mobile version of this game, and it'll be a huge success. Hint, hint. By 1981, 82, I was starting to write my own games in assembly language for that machine, for the Atari 800. And of course, I did a version of Space War, which is on the left. That was the first assembly language game I did. And then I did a Frogger clone, you can see on the right, called Froggy. And somehow a company in California saw it, which was hard to do before the internet, and somehow they tracked me down. They found the right Eddie Freeze in the country, which is impressive because I was just a teenager working in a pizza place. But they tracked me down, they found me, and I started writing games for them. I made 3 games for them, and they looked like this. It was the Frogger clone. They were afraid we were going to get sued, so we took the cars out and put in jousting knights and called it Princess and Frog. But we still have the frog, so I don't know. And then we had a game called Anteater, which is kind of a little like Dig Dug. And then the final game I made was a game called Sea Chase, where you drive a submarine around and depth charges fall. And by this time I'm in college. I'm going to school in a little college in New Mexico and working on games on the side as I get my computer science degree. But by 1984, it was game over. And a lot of people have heard about the crash of the video game business in 1984. I think that this graph shows it pretty well. I don't know if I guess I have a laser here. It's kind of hard to see, but I put a little red arrow there. The red line represents the consumer or home video game business in the US. It was about $9 billion in 1982, and it was about $0 billion in 1985. So really, the business completely crashed. Almost everybody went out of business, including the company that I work for. So I had to get a real job. I convinced them at the computer center I was good with computers, and I got a job being a system administrator on this machine, a VAX 11750. And what was great about this machine was it ran this game. Does anybody know this game? Yes, go ahead. Rogue. Is that what you said? This guy's good. Rogue. Amazing game. The game that launched a million roguelikes. A lot of people know what a roguelike is, but they don't know what Rogue is. But this is the original game. So anyway, between my between my junior and senior year, I got a job at this company, a company called Microsoft, and went to work for them up in my hometown of Redmond. When I graduated, I was put on the team that was working on Excel. I was the number 7 programmer to work on the first version of Excel for Windows. And we built versions of Excel over the next few years and worked really hard. And when I wasn't at work working on Excel, I was home playing the latest games. Games like Battletech, Crescent Hawks, Inception, fantastic game from Jordan Weissman and his team. This game, all right, you're good. What's this game? Populous, I heard it over here. Very good. Chris Roberts, Wing Commander, Sid Meier's Civilization. That was a great time to be a gamer. But at work, I'm making versions of Excel. We're doing well. We're battling Lotus 123. We beat them. And my boss and I move over and move up to run Word. So now I'm the development manager of Word. We're battling WordPerfect. But of course, at home, I'm still playing all the latest games. Games like this. Dune 2 is correct. The first PC real-time strategy game. In fact, in 1992, I didn't realize till I put this talk together what a watershed year this was. You got the first PC real-time strategy game, then you have this game, Alone in the Dark, which a lot of people don't know this game. This was the first survival horror game. In fact, about 3 or 4 years later, I was in Japan visiting with Capcom, and they were showing me this game that they had under development. It was called Biohazard in Japan, or would later come out here as Resident Evil. And I see the early version of it, and I'm like, this is just an Alone in the Dark ripoff. And they're like, yes, Alone in the Dark. so there you go. And also in 1992, the first kind of modern first-person shooter, Castle Wolfenstein 3D. So big year in gaming. I continue to make words. I'm a gamer on the side, but I'm making office stuff at work. I'm making this guy a lot of money. And I get to the point in my career, I'd been there about 10 years, and they said, well, the next thing for you to do is to run a business. And one of the businesses they offered me to run was to go down to California here and run the PowerPoint business. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to run the games business. Microsoft had a small group that was building games. They had Flight Simulator and not too much else. And my bosses did not like this idea at all. They told me I was committing career suicide. They said, why would you leave office, one of the most important parts of the company, to go work on something no one cares about. Which turned out to be a good thing. I mean, imagine, well, I should just finish the story. I mean, I really put my foot down. I said, no, this is what I wanted to do. And they like rolled their eyes and said, fine, go off and do that. But I found myself with the resources of this huge company behind me. And it was a company that really didn't care what I did. So what would you do? I mean, what would you do if you were in that situation? I bet you would do what I did, which is I just flew all over the world. I met with all the great game designers, developers that I admired, and I tried to sign them up to work with us. And the next 8 years or so were really magical.
Hi, I forgot your name. Whatever. My point is, hi, your head's on fire. Oh damn, you must have got one of them combustible heads. I read an article all about them. You're on fire, you're on fire. I won't lie, you're on fire. Combustible head, combustible head, combustible head, combustible head. Hey, how's it going? Is that your car they're towing? I'm pretty sure that's your car.
Really, everything that we've worked for over the last 4 years is starting to come true.
My point is, your head's on fire. Oh damn, you must have got one of them combustible heads. I read an article all about them. You're on fire, you're on fire. I won't lie, you're on fire. Combustible head, combustible head, combustible head, combustible head. The lights are low, the music is extremely loud. You're hard to get to know, but you're easy to spot in a crowd.
Xbox is just everywhere.
I'm sure you're aware you got one of those rare combustible heads. I read an article all about them. You're on fire, you're on fire. I won't lie, you're on fire. Oh damn, you must have got one of them combustible heads. I read an article all about them. You're on fire, you're on fire. I won't lie, you're on fire.
Okay, I retired from Microsoft in 2004, and I was starting my family. I was turning 40. I was having kids, and I wanted a job that could kind of fit more with that lifestyle. I started working on boards, working with a bunch of nonprofit boards, some of which I'll talk about later, a bunch of company boards, which is something I do today. And I also became an advisor to a lot of different game companies. And again, that's something I also do today. I also helped some friends start a couple game companies. This was one of them. But I tell you, if you're going to pick a year to quit your job, 2004 was a great year because it's the year that this game came out, World of Warcraft. I spent a lot of time with this game, really fell in love with it, had incredible adventures. I loved it so much, I started a little 3D printing company called Fingerprints that takes characters out of the game and turns them into statues, and that's something I still run on the side today. But now I'm like really out of time, and I have to go a lot faster. I'm going to kind of skip this story, but this was one of the battles of the 2000s, the battle for censorship in the video game business. And these two characters really stirred up a lot of trouble. Jack Thompson from Florida, Leland Yee from California. They went around state by state, and they got laws passed trying to restrict what content could be in video games. I'm telling this way too fast, but fortunately the ESA stepped in. I got to be involved in Washington State where we battled and beat one of the cases that was brought by basically these guys. Ultimately, this resulted in a Supreme Court ruling where we barely won. 5 justices out of 9 voted that video games should have the same First Amendment rights as music, movies, TV shows, which is pretty amazing. We only got 5 of 9. In fact, the 5th judge, the guy who wrote the decision, was Justice Scalia, who's not normally known as a liberal guy. But anyway, we're happy to have him on our side for this. So that's fantastic, and the story has a really nice, happy ending because Jack Thompson was disbarred, and we're in California here, so you may know that Leland Yee just reported for his jail term in March of this year. So it's nice to have a happy ending. In 2007, this device came out. This really changed the Casual Connect conference, which was not about mobile games before this. And as you know, mobile games have really grown fantastically to become the number 2 source of revenue in the world. The green line there, you see it growing. Neil Young talked real briefly about VR, and I'm involved with several VR companies as a board member or an advisor. But with the time I have left, I really want to talk about 3 things that matter to me today. The first is trying to work on the diversity problem in the video game business. I spent 3 years as a board member of the International Game Developers Association, also the treasurer of that group, and then I moved to the nonprofit wing, the IGDA Foundation. And I do this not because I'm some social justice warrior, but because I have a mom with a computer science degree who I love, and because there's a real problem in this business. I don't know if you've seen this chart. This basically shows the percentage of women in every degree possible other than computer science, and you can see the lines approach 50%. And the red line is computer science. It peaked at 35% in 1985 and is down to about 17% now. So it's a huge problem. We battle this in the IGDA. We have a grant program in the IGDA Foundation that we support different programs all around the world, thanks to Intel and some of our other sponsors. We bring women to various game conferences that they couldn't otherwise attend. And I think it's a really important thing we do, and we're always looking for more companies to support our work. So talk to me later if you want to become part of that. It's important. The second thing that I'm interested in is video games as an art form. I came to that in a really strange way. I read this book in 2009. It's about programming the Atari 2600, which is a really primitive machine, much more primitive than the Atari 800 I programmed as a kid. And I wanted to see if I could make a game for it. I made this game, Halo 2600, and it's basically what would Halo have looked like if it was released in 1977 on this machine that only has 128 bytes of memory. It's a hard machine to program on, but I managed to get 64 rooms and a boss encounter all in 4K of hand assembly. That's hard for the non-programmers in the room, and I had a lot of fun doing it. Anyway, I wrote a talk about it for the Montreal International Games Summit in 2010, where I compared the constraints of working on this system to the constraints that artists deal with in a lot of other media. Meanwhile, my friend Chris Melosinos was putting together the first art exhibit, the first really major art exhibit in the country that was going to appear at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. It opened in 2012, and it was a huge success, probably the biggest show they've ever had at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I know it sold more books than they've ever sold. And after it ended its run there, it went on toured all over the world, and just finished its tour a few months ago. But out of that, the curator of media arts at the Smithsonian American Art Museum picked 2 games to put into their permanent collection. He picked Flower from that game company, which is a beautiful game, and for some reason he picked my game, Halo 2600. So now all of a sudden I had a game in the Smithsonian, and they did a second art show, which was not just video games, but a lot of different things from their collection. And Kelly Santiago and I went out and we gave a talk, pretended we were artists and talked about our work, and that was fun. And afterwards, they asked me to join something called the Board of Commissioners of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which I officially start this summer. And that means I'll be one of a couple dozen people who review and approve new artworks for the Smithsonian. So I hope to use that position to get more video games into the Smithsonian as works of art. The last thing I want to talk about is preservation of our history. The video game business, as you just saw, has been around about 50 years. If you go back to the early days of film, a lot of the early stuff has been lost because people didn't take care of it. They did not preserve it. And we see the same thing happening in the video game business today, especially in the arcade side of the video game business. So takes me to a quick quiz. What's the first commercial arcade video game? It was Computer Space. I showed it at the beginning. It was a trick question. I bought one of these off eBay that was completely broken, and I fixed it, and I wrote a long story about it, and you should read it because it's fun to watch somebody who doesn't know that much about electronics trying to fix a tube television and then a TTL video game. But here's a really hard question. What was the first color arcade video game? Nobody can answer that question unless they read my blog. But the story goes like this. After Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney created Computer Space, the next year they started their own game company, which became known as Atari. They hired an engineer, Al Alcorn. And Al Alcorn created this first game, Pong, as just sort of a warm-up exercise. And it went on to be hugely successful and funded a lot of their development going forward. Al Alcorn's next game was called Space Race. It's the first racing game in video game history. And you race two spaceships from the bottom of the screen to the top, trying not to get hit by the asteroids. And the third game he created was a game called Gotcha. Gotcha was the first maze game ever in the video game industry. And it was also the first controversial game in video game history. And it was controversial because Nolan Bushnell decided to cover the joysticks with pink rubber domes. I don't know if you can see them there on the left. And so you grabbed that dome and shoved it around to steer your character through the maze. Some places refused to have this in their establishment, and they later had to remove the domes and just use normal joysticks. But the interesting thing about this game was it shows up in some documents that there was a color version of this game, but no one had seen the color version. In fact, it's listed on several websites as being lost. And I, at this time, was collecting printed circuit boards from all these old machines and then fixing them. And I stumbled on this. And I don't know if you can see in the black on top there what it says, but it says Color Gotcha. You know, could this be one of the long-lost Color Gotchas? It has the correct daughter board. I set out to prove that it was. I had to fix the board, which meant tracking down and fixing several bad chips on it. And then I had to figure out how to connect it to a modern monitor. And just earlier this year, I produced the first still and video images of the first color video game, which is what this is, Color Gotcha. So that was exciting. I wrote about it on this blog entry, Fixing Color Gotcha. And again, I encourage you to read that. It's fun. And in that, I try to prove the case that October 1973, when this game came out, it was the very first color arcade game. And I just want to say that making games is hard. You know, cut off my mic. There we go. You're done. I'll just end there. Making games is hard. No, it was hard in the old days. You know, when you were a kid with a computer and you only had a couple manuals and no internet to refer to, no other community of people to work with. And even if you made a game, how would you distribute it? How would you get it out to other people? And what I think is interesting is that it's hard today for the opposite reasons. You know, now we have all this information everywhere. We have incredible tools. We have great distribution sources, App Store and Steam. You know, and it's still hard. It's probably harder than ever. You know, you make a great game, you gotta go up against something like this, like my friends from CD Projekt Red. You know, if you want to make an RPG, that's the standard. Wow, so hard. But I think that we are so lucky to work in this business. You know, we get to spend our time building these little machines of joy. And if we do that job really well, we get to see that joy reflected back at us in the faces of the people who play our creations. And for me at least, that makes it all worthwhile. Thank you.